Hey guys, Dimension Master Studios here. How y'all doing? So, when it comes to Ninjago, we've gotten a lot of different characters over the years, some good and some bad. However, we've also gotten a few characters in the franchise who, in my opinion, are pretty underrated. And in today's video, I want to talk about the character who is, in my opinion, the most underrated character in all of Ninjago, with that character being Nelson. Despite Nelson being a pretty minor character overall when it comes to Ninjago, I still think that Nelson is a legitimately great and compelling character when it comes to the franchise, and in today's video, I want to talk about Nelson and why I think he's a really good character. So, let's get into this whole thing. So, Nelson made his debut all the way back during Season 6, Skybound, during the very first episode of the season, Infamous. And during this episode, Nelson had a pretty minor role during this episode, yet I feel like the stuff that we saw with Nelson during this episode did a good job at establishing multiple things about his character that later seasons would expand upon. So, when it comes to the moment that we get with Nelson, we see the original 6 ninja going to Ninjago City's hospital in order to visit Nelson, who is in the hospital because both of his legs are broken. And the ninja are going to the hospital as a part of the Grant a Wish Foundation in order to grant Nelson's wish, which is for him to become an honorary ninja for a day. However, things go south for the ninja because paparazzi shows up as a result of Kai's chirps. And the ninja are really worried about this because they have to get to Styx in order to stop Klaus. However, Nelson is able to help them out because, as it turns out, when it comes to Nelson, he's not just any ordinary fan of the ninja, he is actually the Purple Ninja, making him the second character in the franchise in order to dub themselves a ninja, with the first character obviously being Dareth, with him declaring himself the Brown Ninja. And when it comes to Nelson, he's able to help out the ninja by getting them to a staircase which will be able to take them to the rooftop of the hospital, and Nelson also does what he can in order to hold off the paparazzi, and right before the ninja leave, they thank Nelson, and Nelson thanks them, telling the ninja how they were able to make his wish come true. And that's all that we saw when it came to Nelson for a long time when it came to the show. But again, even though this moment with Nelson is pretty small, I feel like it honestly does a good job of establishing multiple big things for Nelson's character that later seasons would expand upon. So for starters, let's get a pretty simple yet big one out of the way first, Nelson being a fan of the ninja. This is something that's made really clear during the episode, given that when it comes to Nelson, he declared himself to be the Purple Ninja, and his wish was for him to become an honorary ninja for a day, which is something that the ninja do ultimately grant, and Nelson does become an honorary ninja. And again, this is something that's simple, but it's still a big part of Nelson's character, as we would see later on, specifically though during Season 11 with Nelson's return episode. However, that's not all, as there's a few other interesting things about Nelson's character that we see introduced during this scene. For starters, one big thing that we see when it comes to Nelson is that even though he's injured with both of his legs being broken, Nelson still has a really optimistic and happy view on things, showing us that when it comes to Nelson, even if situations do look pretty bad, Nelson still chooses to look on the positive side of things, and he does what he can to try and find the best in certain situations, which is something that I do think is honestly pretty cool, given that again, Nelson's being put in a pretty tough situation given his injury, yet he's not letting this get him down, and he doesn't see things as being different, which again, I think that's honestly something pretty great. And finally, there's one last major thing about Nelson's character that we see established during this scene, and it's that when it comes to Nelson, despite the fact that he doesn't have access to powers, he's still able to be a hero and he's able to help out people in his own way. We see this with Nelson being able to help the ninja get to the staircase so that way they can get to the rooftop of the hospital, and with him also holding off the paparazzi. And this is something that I honestly really like, because a big message that Ninjago has always had for a long time is the message that you don't need powers in order to be a hero. This is a message that we see presented all throughout the franchise. However, something that we often see when it comes to this message is it usually being associated with combat related stuff. This is something that we see all throughout the franchise, but I think it's honestly great that in this kind of scenario, it's not something that's associated with combat, and instead it's showing us that you can be a hero in other ways. And this is something that we see with Nelson, with him using stuff like his intelligence in order to help out the ninja, which is something that I do think is honestly something pretty cool. And so again, even though this moment is pretty small, I feel like it does a good job at establishing multiple things for Nelson's character that again, later seasons would expand upon. So, following the events of Skybound, we didn't see Nelson again in the show for a while. Initially, Nelson was meant to be in Day of the Departed, back when that was supposed to be a full season. However, as a result of Day of the Departed getting turned into a Halloween special, Nelson was ultimately cut from Day of the Departed, and he never actually appeared in it at any point. He was in one of the sets that was released for Day of the Departed, but that was it. And that's really all we had from Nelson for a long time. That was, however, until season 11, because during this season, we finally saw Nelson return, and I genuinely feel like during this season, Seabound and Crystallized, all three of these seasons did a genuinely fantastic job at expanding on Nelson's character and developing him in legitimately interesting ways. So now let's actually discuss that stuff. So for starters, let's start off with Nelson being a fan of the ninja. This is something that we really only ever see in Nelson's re-debut episode, The News Never Sleeps, during season 11, but honestly, I think that's actually a good thing. I feel like showing us a small bit of Nelson being a fan of the ninja is a really great thing to see, because it shows us that when it comes to Nelson, him being a fan of the ninja isn't one of the only aspects about his character, and there are other big things about his character, which I do think is legitimately something really great. Additionally, something else that I really like is that when it comes to this episode in season 11, we're never actually told that Nelson is a big fan of the ninja. We just see it during the episode. We see that with stuff like Nelson owning a bunch of products that are obviously inspired by the ninja, as well as Nelson still considering himself to be the Purple Ninja. And when it comes to Antonia, a new character that's introduced during the episode, she keeps on referring to Nelson as the Purple Ninja for the remainder of their time in the show. And again, this is something that I think is really great. We get a limited amount of time in order to see stuff with Nelson being a fan of the ninja, which is something that I think is really good because it shows us that there are other aspects to Nelson's character outside of him just being a fan of the ninja. And not only that, we're never outright told that Nelson is a fan of the ninja, and it's not like he's constantly bringing up stuff that the ninja have done. Instead, it's stuff that we're just simply shown at the beginning of the episode, and we get one big moment with it later on during the episode, and that's it. And again, this is something that I think honestly works really well, and I feel like it is a nice expansion of what we saw beforehand when it came to Nelson. Moving on from this, we then have Nelson's optimism, and yet again, this is something that we see the Wildbrain era of the show expand upon, because all throughout the Wildbrain era, Nelson is constantly being placed in pretty bad situations, yet despite this, Nelson still ends up getting a pretty optimistic view on this kind of stuff. Like, for example, during his re-debut episode in season 11, when the city is under attack by fire snakes, while Nelson is initially scared about the whole situation, after Antonia is able to help calm him down, Nelson ends up getting used to the whole thing, and we see that the fire snakes don't really affect him all that much, showing that yet again he's choosing to see the best in the situation. And after Nelson and Antonia learn about the ninja being stuck inside the pyramid, Nelson is determined to go to Sensei Wu and tell him about what's going on, with him hoping that as a result of this, the ninja will be able to be saved, and this is what ultimately happens to the ninja during the episode Ninja vs. Lava. Nelson is the entire reason why the ninja gets saved at the end of that episode, and it was because of his optimism and hope that the ninja would be saved, and this is what ultimately happens. We also see this during Seabound with Nelson and Antonia getting the Storm Amulet away from Calamar, and Nelson being optimistic that they're going to be able to keep it away from him, until that doesn't happen and he does get his hands back on it, but still the optimism was there. And we also see this once again during the episode with Antonia planning on quitting being a paper girl and her going to work at the Dairy Dragon. While Nelson is initially against the idea, he does eventually come around to the idea, and yet again he does choose to see the best in the situation. That is until Antonia reveals that she's going to remain as a paper girl, which makes Nelson really happy because Antonia means a lot to him, because Antonia is his best friend. We also see this during Crystallize, where even after the Overlord has attacked Ninjago City and he's started the Crystal Apocalypse, Nelson still remains really optimistic about the whole situation, and he's constantly thinking that when it comes to the Resistance, they're gonna be able to fight back against the Overlord and eventually stop him. And it's actually because of that optimism, it eventually causes Sensei Wu to change his mind on situation, thus resulting in him being able to give his big speech to the people of Ninjago City. And once again, that happens because because of Nelson, as well as the rest of the paper boys being able to help out Sensei Wu and stopping some of the Vengestone warriors. But again, the person responsible for starting that was Nelson, and again, his optimism is something that we see for the remainder of Crystallized. Heck, even in Prime Empire, a season that Nelson is barely in one of the shorts that we get for Prime Empire, we learn that when it comes to Nelson, his mom got stuck inside the Prime Empire machine, and even though Nelson is worried about her, Nelson is still sure that she's gonna be fine, and this is something that does ultimately happen, with Jay being able to help Unagami work through everything, thus resulting in all the people who were stuck in the game getting freed. So once again, when it comes to Nelson's optimism, this is a big thing that we see all throughout the Wildbrain era of the show, and again, I feel like this era did a good job at expanding on what we saw with Nelson during Season 6. And finally, the last big thing that we see when it comes to Nelson is Nelson being able to be a hero despite him not having any powers. And yet again, this is something that we once again see all throughout the Wildbrain era of the show, because there are so many moments that we get during the Wildbrain era where Nelson has to pull off some stuff that's really hard and difficult, and Nelson doesn't have any powers, and not only that, Nelson's a kid, yet despite this, Nelson is still able to find a way to get through those situations, and he's able to do this kind of stuff and prove himself as a hero despite him not having powers. We see this during Crystallize with Nelson and the other paper boys starting up the resistance and them helping out civilians in any kind of way that they can. We see this during Seabound with Nelson and Antonia helping to get the Storm Amulets away from Calamar, and even though they aren't successful, they're still able to keep it away from him for a long time, and they're also able to pull off some pretty dangerous stunts with their bikes. And again, Nelson doesn't have any powers and he's still a kid and he's able to do this kind of stuff. And during Season 11, we see that when it comes to Nelson, he does whatever he can to try and get to the monastery in order to help out the ninja. Despite the fact that Ninjago City is currently under attack, Nelson and Antonia, and they're able to make their way through the really dangerous situation, again, just on their own without any kind of powers. And again, this is something that I think is honestly really cool to see. And something that I like is that when it comes to Nelson doing this kind of stuff, none of it feels forced or unnatural when it comes to Nelson. It's just based on stuff that he knows how to do, stuff like him riding a bike and him being able to help out others in any way that he can. And it feels like every season builds on the stuff that we saw beforehand when it came to Nelson, with each season expanding on the stuff that we saw with Nelson and the stuff that he could do, with him being able to pull off more really amazing stuff, despite, again, him not having any powers. And again, none of it feels forced or unnatural, which is something that I think is legitimately really cool to see. And so I feel like these do a really great job of showing us that when it comes to Nelson, again, despite him not having access to powers, he can still be a hero in his own way, which again, I think is something really great. And also, like I said earlier, a lot of this stuff isn't related to combat or fighting, but instead it's showing us that you can be a hero in other ways, which again, this is something that I think is legitimately really cool to see. However, that's not all, because the Wildbrain era of the show also introduced us to another aspect about Nelson's character that we would see be present in every single season where he appeared, and that is Nelson being a really great friend and him being really loyal to the people who he considers to be his friends. This is something that we mainly see with Antonia all throughout the Wildbrain era of the show, given that when it comes to Antonia, she means a lot to Nelson because she's his best friend, and we see that when it comes to Nelson, he and Antonia do whatever they can in order to help out one another and support each other, and we know that when it comes to Nelson, again, Antonia means a lot to her, to the point that when Nelson learns that Antonia is going to quit being a paper girl and move on to the Dairy Dragon, Nelson is really hurt by this, because again, Antonia means a lot to Nelson, considering that when it comes to Antonia at this point, she was basically a mentor for Nelson, with Antonia teaching Nelson everything that she knew. But at the same time, like I said, Antonia is Nelson's best friend. And so again, when it comes to Antonia deciding to not be a paper girl anymore, we see that Nelson is really hurt by this. That is until the end of the episode, where Antonia decides to remain as a paper girl because she finally realizes just how much she means to Nelson. But at the same time, she also realizes how much Nelson means to her as well, with her finally accepting Nelson as her best friend, which is something that I think is pretty cool, and this is something that we see continue during Crystallize, with the two of them doing whatever they can in order to help out each other during this season. However, that's not all, because this is something that we also see with the ninja and Nelson doing whatever he can in order to help them out. Like I said, we saw this during season 11 with Nelson doing whatever he could in order to get to the monastery so that way Sensei Wu could be warned about what's going on, but this is something that we also see present during the events of Seabound and Crystallize, with Nelson yet again doing whatever he can in order to help out the ninja in any way possible, showing us that when it comes to Nelson, he's willing to do whatever he can in order to help out his friends and the people who he cares about a lot, which is something that I do think is yet again something honestly really great to see when it comes to Nelson. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So when it comes to Nelson, even though he didn't really play a very large role when it came to Ninjago as a whole, I still think that Nelson is a legitimately compelling and engaging character when it comes to the show, with him having some pretty interesting moments all throughout the events of the show, and I think he has some pretty interesting characterization and some pretty nice character traits when it comes to the show. And again, I feel like the Wild Brain era did a really great job at expanding on the stuff that we saw with Nelson during the events of Season 6. And really, that in my opinion was one of the biggest strengths of the Wild Brain era of the show as a whole, because it was able to take a lot of the older characters in my opinion and expand upon them in really interesting and great ways, which is a big reason why I do really like this era of the franchise. And hopefully when it comes to Dragons Rising, if and when Nelson does show up during this era, hopefully that era does also do a good job at expanding on Nelson's character, and who knows, when it comes to Nelson's return, we might get a chance to see him going from just being the honorary Purple Ninja to the official Purple Ninja. I think that could honestly be something really cool to see, but we're just going to have to wait and see what happens. And so that's pretty much all I got for you guys. So tell me down below what you guys think. Tell me what are your guys' thoughts when it comes to Nelson. Again, tell me down below and I hope you guys enjoy. Later guys, this is Dimension Master Studios, signing off.